Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today, we're really fortunate to have Jörn Seemann, associate professor of geography at Ball State University. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. It's a great pleasure to get involved in one of your conversations, and I'm really eager to chat about life, geography, and everything.
I'm very happy to hear that, because first we're going to talk about, if you don't mind, what inspired you to pursue geography? Perhaps you could comment on your childhood, adolescence, and early schooling in geography before moving on to your university studies.
Sure, we can do this. Of course, the older we get, the more we think about, well, what we did in life and what we didn't do in life. So probably it's not very easy to trace back my past and find out exactly what happened that I got into geography. So I've got several theories about this, and I keep thinking about this all the time. But probably it was also the setting of the late 70s. So we had some kind of competition between friends to know who knew more capital cities than other people. So we even had some kind of competition. We identified flags. And curiously, this kind of geography is the geography that we kind of want to change at school, because it's this kind of memorizing places. But I think the difference is that evidently I did not restrict myself to the names, but with a map or the big blue school atlas that we used in the 1970s. So I flipped through the pages and looked at the places. And I got curious about place names. So probably this is one of the reasons why I love studying place names and writing about this. So this could be some kind of trajectory in my life that kind of sparked my interest in geography. And I remember in the 5th grade, there was a geography test, and I didn't get the perfect score, because I was not able to locate a city that was in a specific latitude and longitude. And I still remember the place that I missed. It's Muscat in Oman. But it kind of sparked, you see, these are all chats from my neighborhood. But I think that what really helped me is, it's really some kind of curiosity about space or place. That's nothing that is a tradition in my family, but it's something that I developed. And in high school, I had the opportunity to take, let's say, intensive geography courses. So we met 3 times a week, and we got through more applied topics like the geography of the United States, of the Soviet Union, and so on, including a field trip to the former GDR. Mm-hmm. So this kind of sparked my idea about geography. Curiously, after I finished high school, I did something totally different. So for me, there were 2 passions. One was to learn English, even with a, let's say, a focus on British English and my still heavy German accent. And on the other hand, I really liked geography, or in Germany, as they called it, Erdkunde. Mm-hmm. So when I finished high school, I joined the German Air Force. Mm-hmm. Probably it was more because my mother was kind of concerned about my future and you need a safe job. So I was dreaming about applying my knowledge of English and maybe a little bit of geography, working in the control tower. However, I never reached the tower. I remained in the floor below as a flight dispatcher. And after 2 years, I kind of found out that I can do other things in my life. And this was more or less a time that I did not only look at places on the maps, but I started traveling a little bit. So I had a chance to go to England. I walked in the Lake District for 10 days. I picked a bicycle and traveled through Ireland. I had a trip with a German youth hostel organization to Egypt. So this all kind of sparked my interest. And after I left the German Air Force, I really said, well, now it's time to study geography. And something that I always used as a justification sounds a little bit lame, but the idea was that I wanted to understand the world, that when you're walking around, traveling, and whatever, you look out of the window, that you kind of understand the configurations, the patterns, and so on. So at that time, I didn't use the term pattern at all.
And so you completed your studies in Germany at Hamburg.
Yes, that's correct. So it was in 1989 that I signed up for the geography program. And I spent about 5 years studying, and different from the studies in the United States and other places, when you enter university, you will leave university with something they call a diploma, which is equivalent to a master's degree. So I spent some 5 years at the university, and curiously, today I'm doing something at the interface of maps and society. But at that time, I was really keen on physical geography. So I studied geomorphology. So sometimes I take pride in saying that I had 10 semesters of soil science. And with all these fascinating things, I even had some 2 years of geology. I needed to do some kind of a trainee program, and that was sometime in the early 90s that I spent 2 months in the Netherlands at a soil reference center where they prepared soil samples for a museum. And so these contacts, I got another trainee offer in Brazil. So in 93, I decided to spend 6 months in Brazil. So it's some kind of one thing leads to another.
Sure. Here's a question about Hamburg. Did you ever, although you were emphasizing physical geography, there was a historical geographer and cartographer named Lafrance at Hamburg, who did a lot of interesting work in the Jutland Peninsula. Did you happen to take part in any of his field trips?
Well, if it's the same person that I remember, Lafrance, probably. So he was one of my professors at that time. And technically, he was some kind of advisor for me, so he was not my advisor, and he didn't like my final product. But this is, of course, another story. But
he used to stare off into space, I think, when he would talk to people.
Jürgen Lafrance, that's his name. Could have been him, but I was more closer to the geomorphology people and the soil science people. But at any rate, so some people told me that the late 80s and the early 90s were some kind of lost decade in geography in Germany because it was some kind of redefinition. So I only found out later that one of my inspirations was a Latin Americanist geographer called Gerhard Sandner, who did a lot of stuff in Latin America. And he was also some kind of, let's say, I wouldn't say bully, but a person in the sense that he kind of questions things, including the past of university, Hamburg University, because Hamburg has got some kind of, let's say, not so glorious past. One of the famous geographers from the 1920s, more or less, Siegfried Passarge, was professor there. And his past is not very glorious in the sense of being a collaborator with the Nazis.
Sure.
So Dr. Sandner had the opportunity to study the past of the university, and some people at university were not amused about this, but he found out a lot about this. So probably it's helped me a little bit to get interested in, let's say, geopolitics and political geography later. So this is not exactly my area.
Well, you've done a number of things. So you end up going to Brazil. Would you care to comment on your time in Brazil? It's a lot of time, I know.
Yeah, no, that's a kind of weird story, and I do not regret this. So when I went to Brazil in '93, that was still the time that you could travel around the country with an air pass. So it was about $300, $400, and you had 5 flights in 3 weeks, and you could travel the country from north to south and east and west. So I really did this. So I went to the north, to Manaus and Belém. I went to the center west, Cuiabá. I went to the south, and it happened that on a hot Saturday afternoon, August the 14th, 1993, I met my future wife. So that was more, let's say, it's a personal story that I ended up in Brazil because at university I had classes in Spanish. But of course, this does not work at all when you're living in Brazil.
Hmm.
So after I spent the time in Brazil, I returned to Germany in order to finish my studies, which happened in the end of 1994. And I did something that people do not do. I just decided, well, I packed my things and returned to Brazil without much money in my pocket, without a job and anything. So sometimes I joke and say that a normal German wouldn't do this because there was no safety net at all.
I guess you're not a normal German.
Well, whatever normal means.
And so I have a question, though, about you traveling around the country of Brazil then in the early 90s. I mean, this is right around the time, and you went to Manaus. This is around the time that there was considerable Amazonian deforestation taking place, and there were efforts made to develop hydroelectric power throughout this entire area. Did that captivate you at all? Did you notice any of that?
Curiously, I was not so much interested in this. I think still today I feel more like or maybe I was not aware about this. I feel more like a cultural geographer. So something that really fascinated me in Brazil was the language and the different versions of the language, but also mainly food. So I really got interested in this. So I remember when I was in Manaus, and it's not an attractive city. So it's some kind of a demographic mushroom of 2 million people today. So I spent 3 or 4 days there. I booked a trip into the jungle, slept in a hammock, and ate piranhas, and all these things. And I went to the local market where I bought a fish tongue that is a bone tongue, the so-called pirarucu fish. So I kind of it seems I kind of created memories about Brazil, about my traveling. So I always said that I was a cultural sponge, absorbing many different things. But curiously, coming back to your question, in a certain way, I got into more critical views of the Amazon when I returned to Brazil. So in 1995, I spent some time in Belém. My wife is from that region. And I worked together with people from the Federal University. They had the so-called Poema project, which was poverty and environment in the Amazon. And the leader of the group was a German sociologist, as far as I know, Thomas Mitschein. And I got the opportunity to earn a few dollars, not much, traveling to the river communities and mapping their backyards. So I got really excited about this because these places there, everything is on stilts and a lot of mud and water. So I spent the time there with a hammock, sleeping in their house and getting food, and then walking around on shaky planks in the backyard in order to know, well, what kind of tree is that, and what do you use this plant for, and so on. So I visited some 5, 6, 7 different communities. It was really fascinating that they were so close together, but each of the community had a totally different lifestyle. So probably this is something that really stuck in my head. This kind of curiosity that drives you, that pushes you in order to go further.
And so after you were engaged in this project, what did you do?
Well, there was no funding for me left, so I had to take care of my legal status in Brazil because at that time I had some kind of student visa, and we decided to marry in 1995. But I had to go to the federal police in the place where I registered, and this was on the other side of the country in Rio Grande do Sul, in the extreme south of the country. So we got married, and I kind of traveled by bus. So it took me some 2 or 3 days to go to the south in order to resolve my problems, which took me some 2 years in order to get straight. But when I was in the south, a friend of mine whom I met in Germany, where he studied history, and he wrote a thesis on German immigrants in southern Brazil. I got really interested in this topic. I said, well, okay, Germans in Brazil. So I spent several months for food and lodging in a community that still spoke German. But it was really curious because the German was more like some kind of a 19th century German. And they even had researchers from Germany who were studying the dialects because they did not exist in the same form anymore in Germany. So this was really some kind of life experience. We got up early in the morning, and then we picked a small tractor, and we got into the cornfield and picked the crops from the plants. So after that, I was able to return to the north, but it did not work out. And after that, we returned, my wife and I, to southern Brazil. And it's really complicated because, well, that would be more than 35 minutes probably. But at any rate, finally, I found some work in Fortaleza in the northeast. So I was working for a company that was producing maps for mid-size towns in the state. And it was some kind of crude method because it was remote sensing. And my task was to georeference the images and then to digitize the features on top of this. So you see that my trajectory is some kind of mix of culture with also a lot of cartography, because through this job, I got in touch with the state university in Fortaleza, and by chance they had a position for an instructor. So I started there in 1998 teaching cartography and topography. And that was surveying methods. And that was really a challenge for me because I had about 2 or 3 weeks in order to get prepared for this. And probably I knew as much about this as my students did in the first semester. And after that, someone discovered that I also had a minor in cultural anthropology. So I was also teaching cultural anthropology at that time.
Well, that background then really prepared you to pursue the doctorate in geography at LSU in their combined geography and anthropology department.
Well, yeah, I wish I could tell you that this was straightforward because it was not something straightforward. So basically what happened when I was in northeastern Brazil, I needed a permanent job because it was just signing up for 1 more year. So there was a tenure track position about 300 miles inland at a different state university, where I arrived in 2002 teaching cartography, working a lot with teacher education. And after 4 years, I had the right to study for my PhD. And the good thing in Brazil is that you can go on a sabbatical of 4 years and you still get your pay. So, of course, I was thinking about, so where do I want to go? And I was still thinking very British in everything I was doing. So I wanted to study at the University of Manchester in England, because I got in touch with Chris Perkins, who was one of those people at that time who did a lot on maps and society and critical mapping, counter cartographies, and so on. But evidently, I was not eligible for a stipend, for assistantship, because after more than a decade in Brazil, I was not eligible for a European grant. So a key moment for me was in 2002 when I met an American geographer, Dan Gady, at a conference
University of Vermont.
in Rio de Janeiro. And from that time onwards, we talked a lot. And he was the person who said, so why don't you want to study in the United States? So I heard about Don Mitchell at Syracuse, but I ended up not getting an assistantship. And the following year, I tried again, and this time I applied at LSU. So Dan Gady was one of the recommendation writers for me. So he wrote a letter, and I was able to get an assistantship to study together with Kent Matthewson. So this is a really kind of weird situation for me. So in August '06, when we traveled to United States, me, my wife, and our 3-year-old son, I didn't have the minimal idea about what to expect in the United States because I was so focused on my European heritage that I was not so sure how the country would be. And evidently, Louisiana is not exactly a representative place to understand what's going on in it.
Evidently, that's the case, or Baton Rouge certainly isn't, is it? And so there and at LSU, you studied with Kent Matthewson, and were there others that you found to be rather striking in guiding you to complete your doctorate?
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, I was very excited about studying in a department that was geography and anthropology. As I mentioned, I have a minor in anthropology. So I always wanted to see the relations between space and culture. And Kent was the reference for me because back in Brazil, I did several studies on historical figures in geography that were important to cultural geography, like the German Otto Schlüter.
Who influenced Sauer considerably.
Yes, and Franz Boas, who was considered the father of American anthropology. So in a certain way, I was recruited to do this work because as a German, I read German. And we had several events in Brazil that I presented papers on this. So this kind of entitled me to work together with Kent Matthewson because, it's about Carl Sauer. And in Brazil, since the mid-1990s, some geographers were able to introduce Carl Sauer to Brazilian geography. So in a certain way, we had a lot to talk. And when I arrived in Baton Rouge, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, I met Kent, and he said the following: "Yeah, so Carl Sauer, that's my idol, but the idol above any kind of veneration, that's Humboldt." So at that time, I even got a little bit into Humboldt's writing. I even wrote a paper on Humboldt's quasi trip to Brazil because he never crossed the Brazilian border, and it took me some time to accept this because for me, Carl Sauer and the Berkeley School were kind of empirical without any kind of critical grounding in geography. So for me, it was fine because as a historian of geography, it does not matter if you like it or not, or if it's your area, but it kind of helped me to understand this and also to appreciate what Carl Sauer did. So apart from Kent, there was another important figure in the department, who was an anthropologist. Miles Richardson was a really, famous anthropologist, also owing to the classes that he was offering. So he had a class called Poetics of Place, and I was really crazy about this class. And I think there was no spot left, but Kent was able to sign me up for this class. So Miles Richardson was, he was already in his 70s. He had a really different approach to, anthropology, geography. But I remember that in his course, we did a kind of poetics of the levees in Baton Rouge, which resulted in a book with poems that each of us wrote. I still got a copy of this. So something that really fascinated me was that Miles, he was so open to any kind of idea. And I always remember the sign on his door, subvert the dominant paradigm. That does not mean that I subvert everything, but that you have a critical approach to geography. So it really helped me to think outside the box. So one more person to mention, and she was also one of your invited geographers in your program, Didier Deleuze. So,
a wonderful person.
So I felt that when I was working on my PhD on what I call cultural geographies in Northeast Brazil, I felt that something was missing. So as I mentioned, I wanted to have some kind of critical grounding. So I recruited Didier as a co-advisor to kind of have the bulldog function, in a sense that she's a kind of merciless tracker when it comes to being an advisor. But it really helped me, and I took several classes with her. One was on recent trends in cultural geography, and the other one was on qualitative methods. So this was something that I never really thought about. So how do you conduct an interview? How can you code interviews? So it was a ton of work to do, but it really helped me to think outside the box, to do something that goes beyond what I learned in geography. So in the 4 years at LSU, I think I learned stuff that would be valid for 10 years probably. By the experience that I had.
That's a wonderful story about your time at LSU and how your teaching in Brazil sparked that transition. So you went back to Brazil after LSU?
Yes, I had to go back because the rule was that when you spend 4 years abroad, you have to spend at least 4 years at your university. So I returned to my little spot in the backlands. And all the time in Brazil, I was kind of struggling with the geography. So when I arrived in Brazil, it was, I was a German geographer without any, let's say, baggage of German geography. And I encountered Brazilian geographers that had a really strong Marxist idea about geography, and they really focused on mainly on one person, Milton Santos, who's a really prestigious geographer. But
his book was just translated into English a few years ago.
Yes, so. The nature of space, I think, is important. And there's a second one, and there's quite a lot going on. And in the Journal of Latin American Geographer, we even had a book review forum on this book. So we had 4 or 5 reviews and a rejoinder of the translator. So I was kind of desperate because I didn't want to follow this geography. So I had to do my DIY geography in the sense that I had to drink from different sources. So this is how I stumbled into my heroes in cultural geography. Not necessarily Carl Sauer, but one of the people that really marked me was Dennis Cosgrove, whom I had the pleasure to meet for 5 minutes a year before he passed on. So I had to construct my own geography. So back in Brazil, I was really eager to get out of there because I remember when I arrived at LSU, I almost cried when I saw the library, and the same conditions did not exist in Brazil. But of course today, most of the stuff that you need, you find on the internet. So
But
I spent about
that shift occurred very rapidly. The shift from stacks in a library holding all kinds of
yeah.
books and journals to where almost everything is at our fingertips now was a very rapid shift in academia.
That's true. I still prefer paper copies of books or print out text, but I'm kind of adjusting to this new reality. So one of the challenges for me was that between 2011 and 2015, I was traveling back and forth between the United States and Brazil because my wife and my son stayed in the United States. So she started studying at the Baton Rouge Community College. And I didn't have a job offer in the United States, neither a green card in order to work legal in the United States. So that was quite a long process. And another difficulty was that when you applied American universities, even with a green card, well, they kind of turn you down because your CV looks too exotic. So it took me some 30, 40 applications. And in February 2015, I was invited to a job interview at Ball State University. So the position is a position that does not exist anymore. It was in cartography. And since I had been teaching cartography for 20 years or 15 years, so it was really, it almost had my name on it. So the problem was that at that time I was back in Brazil, but they said, well, we will reimburse you and want to have you on campus for a job interview. So probably this is something that goes into history as far as temperature drops are concerned. So I was in northeastern Brazil, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and I arrived in Muncie at 0 Fahrenheit. So it was a change of about 80 degrees. And the job interview worked out well, and we had a lot of fun. And I got an offer, and I started here at Ball State in August 2015.
That's wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about your research. You've done a number of things, published a number of papers, among them in the history of geography, children's geographies. I find these captivating. Would you care to comment on a couple of things? One would be your work in children's geographies, especially with regard to the maps, and two, the role of an academic pursuing studies in the history of geography. You're the chair of the History of Geography Specialty Group. What is the purpose?
So
those are two different questions, but I'll just ask you to choose which one you want to follow first.
Yeah, I will go with the children's maps and everything, and of course something that I mentioned, Humboldt. So in a certain way, my trajectory is Humboldtian in a sense that I'm not a specialist. It means that it's just this kind of natural curiosity, which was taught to me by Dan Gady, who also wrote a book on geography and curiosity. And when I met him the first time, he gave me a printout of a paper on geography and shamans. So I really enjoyed this. But when I was in Brazil, it was more about teacher education in geography. And cartography was really a challenge because people played this down, dumped it down, and my challenge was to show that there's some kind of critical cartography there, which is from the bottom to the top. So it means that cartography can also be a weapon and can be something in order to practice citizen geography. And that's the reason why I have probably a dozen of papers in Portuguese on maps and mappings in education, but I also published 2 books in Portuguese. And the last one, which you can translate as Cartographic Chronicles, is a collection of some 20 texts that was specifically written for school teachers. So I didn't want to publish a book, I wanted it to be read. And I ended up buying the full edition of the books. And that time probably was at about $2 per book. And whenever I went to conferences, I had some 20, 30, 40 books in my baggage. And it was $2, so I sold it for $2.50 in order to offset my costs. So I really enjoyed this. So maybe my contribution to subverting the paradigms in geography that kind of not everyone likes what I'm doing. So coming back to the history of geography. So what I told you, for me, it was always fascinating to read about how geographers thought in the past, what kind of geographies existed. So I wrote about Humboldt, I wrote about Schlüter, Franz Boas, and the next one on the list did not work out because I was going to the United States for my PhD, and this was a guy called Eduard Hahn. And curiously, all these figures, they were linked to Karl Sauer. So Eduard Hahn, he had some kind of model about the stages of agriculture in humankind. And he had some thought-provoking ideas in the 1910s, 1920s about the origins of economic work. And he said, well, this is, first it's the women started this. And second, the origins of agriculture are in religion. So people at that time, they found out, that this guy is crazy. So I've still got tons of pages of this at home, but I haven't had time. So I'm telling you that because I think it's so fascinating to look into how people thought in the past, because it will also help us to understand how people are thinking today. So I wrote a lot. My passion is Ratzel, Friedrich Ratzel, because I discovered it's not about the caricature of him as an environmental determinist, but it's also about Ratzel as a hiker in the Alps, and Ratzel as someone who wrote poetry and was romantic about landscapes. So when I think about my idea of history of geography, so in a certain way, our conversation here is a part of the history of geography. But at the same time, I also felt that the history of geography, I use the plural because I like better, histories of geography. They were kind of limited to academic geography. So one of the projects I'm doing right now is about Peace Corps volunteers in Latin America in the 1960s. And sometimes you kind of feel that people look at this, is this history of geography? But my point is that it's not only about, well, what academics and the big shots produced, but also what ordinary people thought about geography, their geographical imagination. So I think this is something for the future in the history of geography, to think more about ordinary geographies, ordinary people doing geography, and not only what is produced in academic settings. And for me, this is also something that I feel I've been doing in the last, let's say, 5-10 years, is to do some kind of grassroots geography, working with communities, for example. And of course, there's also a lot of history in this. So just taking the example of the geographical expeditions in Detroit and Bill Bungay and his project. So for me, there's also a switch not only to dive into archives, but also to go out and let's say resurrect memories and reconstruct the past.
I think those are very profound thoughts that you've shared. Certainly the notion that we are exploring histories of geography, not just one history of geography. And yes, the academic elites do not have the franchise on everyone's history of geography, for sure. Now, with just a minute to go here, I'm going to ask you if you have any advice for undergraduates or graduate students interested in pursuing geography as a field of study or as a career?
Well, I would say that the situation is kind of bleak in the present. In a state like Indiana, geography is not part of the school subjects. So it's a constant battle to convince people that geography matters, that geography can be a social science, geography can change the world. And we are not too successful with this. So what I would recommend, and from time to time I stumble into a student and said, oh yeah, that's really important. I think something really important is that, well, you should have your focus. So in our department, it's much about GIS and meteorology, which are not exactly my fields, but you should also diversify. So it means that even if you're studying meteorology, you should not have only your professional knowledge, but also open your horizon to other things. I always mention this German term, Fachidiot, which is a specialized idiot, because some people, they know everything about the topic that probably only 5 people in the world understand. So I think one of my concerns is always and this is also a tip for anyone. So whatever you study, whatever you do, it's not worth anything if you're not able to teach this to other people, if you cannot communicate this to other people, if you cannot share that with other people, and other people can give you some more input, can give you different ideas. So it's some kind of constant learning process that turns geography fascinating. I wish that people would not only watch this video with our conversation, but I wish they would also think about this and say, well, geography is not bad after all in order to study as a major.
Well, it is relevant, and I am convinced that these students searching for a way to make a difference should pursue this field if they find it interesting, for it is relevant. And as you said, unfortunately, many states do not have geography in the public schools, which makes American students really handicapped when they come to university. They go, we might have geography majors that will miraculously appear in a rather serendipitous manner in their 3rd or 4th years of their undergraduate program. And unfortunately, in some places where there are those resources, the faculty might be characterized by the Fachidioten that you have just mentioned. So yes, we are fighting a battle in many ways, but again, I agree. It's very important for one to look at studies that are relevant and to make a difference. Jörn, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, the pleasure was all mine. I only regret that probably I could have continued chatting for more than 2 or 3 hours.
We could have gone for hours longer, but maybe at the AAG we'll have that opportunity. You know?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was a great pleasure to be with you and to talk about geography. Thank you so much for the invitation.
You're welcome, and thank you so much. And this concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.